My name is Mary Pat Kelly. I live in New York City, but I was born and raised in Chicago. And even though I've lived here since 1970, I consider myself really a Chicagoan. And I think the Chicago Irish experience is unique and quite different than the Eastern experience. And one of the main ways was that most of our immigration did happen in the 1840s and 50s during the Great Starvation. And so people that I grew up with, while they were very proud of being Irish, really didn't have much connection to Ireland itself. For us, being Irish was turning the river green on St. Patrick's Day and music. We didn't really know where our ancestors had come from. And when I began my journey, which started with studying Irish literature, then I got involved in doing documentaries. And while I was becoming very, very knowledgeable about Ireland, I thought, making many trips, I did a documentary about John Hume. I wrote my dissertation on women in Irish literature. When people would ask me what county my people were from, I'd always say Cook County, Chicago. And that really undermined my credibility among Irish people, the fact that I didn't know where the home place was. Even after I married Martin Sheeran from County Tyrone, we went back and his aunt said to me, Martin's American wife, and I said, well, actually, I'm Irish. And she said, what's your home place? And I didn't know, so I went back to be Martin's American wife. And so when I got really interested in the history of Ireland and making visits to Ireland, in 1982, I realized that we had a cousin who was 107 years old. And so when I did the math, I realized she must have known the people that came over in the 1840s, because she was born in 1889, and that was still when they were, in their 40s and 50s, and possible to connect to her. So she was the one that really opened up the door for me by giving me the name of my great-great-grandmother, who was Honora Keeley. Now, she didn't know where she was from. She thought Galway, but she had married Michael Kelly. She had an address in Chicago. And so I went on the microfilm. This is 1982, 83, before the internet, before Ancestry.com. And when I looked at the dates that my own great-grandfather was born, 1840, then his brother 1842, and then no more until they came. And so I realized, wait a minute, those are the years of the Great Starvation. And I had done enough research to realize that calling it a famine was really a misnomer, because there was food in the country. The potatoes had failed, and that was the food of the people. But in other European countries, the potatoes had also failed, but they kept the food in the country, and people did not starve to death. I mean, I did find that famous letter from Nassau Senior saying that 1 million have died. I fear it's not enough. We have to hope another 1 million will die. So having done all that research and now realizing that my own family had left because of the Great Starvation just opened up everything for me. And I started to write what would become Galway Bay. So when I discovered Honora Keeley Kelly, it inspired me to tell her story through this book, Galway Bay, which was a way of talking about the Great Starvation through one family's experience, my own family, the Kellys. One amazing thing that happened was when I was speaking to this cousin who was a nun, Sister Mary Erigena, BVM, when I asked her what they had said, what this great-great-grandmother said about the experiences in Ireland, she said they wouldn't talk about it, which I think is very common. I think one reason why the Great Starvation has not gotten the attention in this country that it deserves is because it was so painful that the people put it behind them and just went on with things. But I kept bugging Sister Mary Erigena to tell me anything, and she did tell me this sentence that Honora had said to her, and I use it as the preface of my book. She said, "We wouldn't die, and that annoyed them. They'd spent centuries trying to kill us off one way or another, and here we were, raising 7, 8, 9 of a family on nothing but potatoes and buttermilk. But then the blight destroyed the potato. 3 times in 4 years, our only food rotted in the ground." And she talks about how they starved, but that while 1 million died, 2 million escaped, one helping each other. It actually is one of the great rescues in human history where the victims saved themselves. And I think that story resonates not only with Irish people, but with any American, because every group, every ethnic group, faced some kind of disaster, whether it was war or famine or the Holocaust or the Middle Passage. And yet someone within that group, and usually it was a woman, says, "We will survive." And that's really what I was interested in, how people survived the Great Starvation, how they came over here. I recently was sent a genealogical chart that starts with Honora Kelly and goes on for 30 pages with her descendants. So the fact that this one woman got out, was able to save her children's lives, it had resonance that we can't even understand. One of her grandsons became Ed Kelly, the mayor of Chicago, who was very instrumental in nominating Franklin Roosevelt and had a big influence on American politics. So you just never know. The fact that someone lived and was able to come to this country, make a life, have a family, has incredible resonance. And I think, as I said, it's every American group. But I think the Irish particularly have not said as much as we need to say about the great strength of these survivors. So that's what I tried to do with Galway Bay. And then the second book, which is called Of Irish Blood, is the next generation, and they become involved with the Ireland War for Independence. And now I'm on book 3, which is the rise of political power in this country, Ed Kelly and his friendship with Joseph Kennedy and the Kennedys. So I'm having a good time telling the story, but it was when I made that personal connection that this is my family's story, as it is the story of so many, 40 million in America. When I discovered the identity of my great-great-grandmother, Honora Keeley Kelly, I was desperate to find out where she came from, because again, my connection to Ireland was just kind of Ireland, not a specific place. So it took me about 10 years to really find the place. And it was Barna, which is just outside of Galway, on Galway Bay. It's a beautiful place. I mean, I would have accepted whatever home place, but to have it be right there on the shores of Galway Bay was wonderful. And when I stood at that spot, I felt a completion that I hadn't realized. I felt that there was kind of an empty part of myself that was filled, that now I was on that piece of earth that really belonged to me. And that led me to research her family, and it turns out they came from Connemara. So now I had Connemara in the story. They came from near Carna, and that they were fishermen. And I also discovered that they lived in a fishing village right on the shores of Galway Bay. And in 1847, just at the height of the Great Starvation, they were all evicted. Even though they had paid their rent, they were all evicted by soldiers. Their houses were set on fire, the thatched roofs torched. And the reason was that the landlord had decided that he wanted to sell the plot of land for a seaside resort. And I thought, if there's anything that shows the disconnect between the landlords of Ireland, between the British and the people, was in the midst of the Great Starvation, when there are bodies in the roads, he's thinking about starting a seaside resort. So that scene is part of the book. Then how they escape, how they came through New Orleans, which I think is very interesting. New Orleans was the third biggest port of the Irish coming into the US, but because they didn't keep great records, that's not generally known. The first was Canada, because that was the cheapest way to come. The second was New York, and the third was New Orleans. And the Kellys came up the Mississippi River to Chicago through the I&M Canal. And the building of the canal was important because a lot of Irish workers came over, and they were able to send the money home to come back over. So I found out a lot of details. The book does go forward to the Civil War and the Irish that served in the Civil War. And it's a love story, too, between the Michael Kelly and Honora, and the love that they feel for each other and for their children was something that the hardship could not destroy. I'm working now on a series with Roma Downey, the producer, and she came up with a great phrase: they had nothing, they had everything. Because they did have the love for each other, they had their faith, and as I discovered, it was a faith that was really based on love of the landscape, the holy wells, the mountains. because there were not a lot. It was not that long ago when the Catholic religion was outlawed. So there were a lot of folk kinds of rituals and things that kept their faith alive. And the family then, the next generation, my own great-grandfather Patrick then fought in the Union Army. There's a lot of stories in the book. In fact, Frank McCourt used to tell me, when you go out, tell people they can buy the damn book and read it themselves. So I will encourage you to do that.